As we do every week, it's time to speak to the author of international bestsellers, including The War on the West, The Strange Death of Europe, and The Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray. Douglas, you've been the #1 trending topic in Australia for several days now. You're in Israel, and a clip of you went viral recently when, during an interview, you had to take cover due to a Hamas rocket. And so I want to take you back to the statement you were in the middle of making. You were saying that the comparisons between Hamas and the Nazis is insufficient. Are you really saying that Hamas are worse than the Nazis?
Well, I am, yes, in one way in particular, which is that as anyone who's seen the result of the atrocities of the 7th of October will know, and anyone who's seen the raw footage from that day will know, there's an oddity about Hamas which just needs to be highlighted better. And that is this, everybody talks about the Nazis, everyone in our era in Australia and Britain, and Europe and America and the West, they seem to think the Nazis is the only point of comparison. But for once, there is a comparison worth making, because the Nazis, even the SS battalions who were shooting Jews in the back of the head and kicking them into ditches, had to get very drunk in the evening to try to forget what they were doing. There were the people who did these atrocities mainly, it seems, although they were completely guilty of them, did feel some shame for them. Remember that the Nazis even tried to cover over Treblinka death camp as they retreated. Now, there's a difference, which is that the Hamas terrorists of October the 7th actually rejoiced in their acts of evil as they were carrying out. They actually boasted about them. In one now quite famous call, one of the people who had just killed 10 Jewish people in their homes phones back to his parents in the Gaza and says, Father, you should be so proud. Your son has killed 10 Jews with his own hands. Get mother on the phone. That is an order of evil and just sadism that, as I say, for once, it's not hyperbole to say even the Nazis in the main didn't behave like this.
Now, the British Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has penned a column for The Times, arguing that there is a perception that senior police officers are playing favourites when it comes to protesters. They can be very heavy-handed when it comes to some protesters on the right side of politics, but they do not want to upset pro-Palestinian protesters, BLM, climate change activists, for example. What did you make of this piece by Braverman?
I thought it was a much needed intervention. Suella Braverman is one of the few brave people in British politics. She actually speaks for the majority of the British public, in my view. And she's completely right simply on this issue of policing. We've seen in recent years, first of all, when the BLM protests went on in London, which got very unpleasant, we had officers of the Metropolitan Police taking the knee when the crowd insisted that they do so. And they actually did in that, that gesture that people did at the time.
Oh, yes.
As a sort of kowtowing gesture. They actually did that. We've seen Extinction Rebellion and other eco-loon protests where the police have actually, there was one protest, they shut down a bridge in London, and there was video of a policeman actually sort of like getting on a skateboard and playing with the activists instead of wrenching them off the roads and getting them arrested. There's no doubt that there's a double standard in policing, and we've seen it in spades in recent weeks with the anti-Israel demonstrations in London and across the UK. People have been threatened with arrest if they go near these protests carrying an English or a British flag, because that would be, Rita, inflammatory. But at the same time, the police have stood idly by as people have called for jihad, for genocide, and much more. It's an obscene double standard, but we can see why. One police officer even said as much last week on camera, said, "We're outnumbered here." So they are clearly intimidated by this mob. I think that's wrong. I think that Braverman is absolutely right to say there's a double standard and it has to change.
And on the climate change cultists, we just had Just Stop Oil step up their violent antics with this act of vandalism at the National Gallery in London.
Women did not get the vote by voting. It is time for deeds and not words.
They are becoming more destructive, Douglas. It used to be paint, now they're taking sledgehammers to these paintings.
It's unbelievable to view, of course. I mean, it's just appalling. This particular painting that was attacked, the Rokeby Venus of Velázquez, was attacked before. It was slashed in 1914 by a suffragette. And these vandals this week clearly felt they were treading in her footsteps. They hadn't quite done their research because the suffragette in question ended up joining up with Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, which just goes to show, among other things, that the path of history isn't quite as straightforward as some of these people would think. But, you know, watching them take these mallets and hammers to smash one of Velázquez's great masterpieces. I mean, we don't know yet what damage they may have done to the canvas. They obviously repeatedly smashed the glass protecting this masterpiece. But to see them get away with this is a reminder of this is what happens if you allow a 2-year-old child to keep pushing. You know, the 2-year-old child will keep pushing to get further and see what they can get away with. Well, it's just the same with these eco-vandals. You know, they, as you mentioned, Rita, they threw soup over a Van Gogh painting in the same gallery. Two of them glued their hands to the 18th century frame in which another Van Gogh masterpiece was hanging. And do you know how much those two got fined eventually? £500 a piece. £500 a piece. Oh. So it turns out it's a bit of a bargain if you want to get your international message across and create a little act of terror. It's quite a bargain to go in and assault the completely, I mean, guiltless collection of the National Gallery in London. It's very cost efficient, it turns out. So surprisingly enough, after they'd come with the soup and with the glue, the next time they came with their mallets and their hammers. I wonder what they'll use next time, unless the authorities stop them.
Now, Douglas, we have seen the left, which dominate the media, academia, much of the culture, completely redefine words, including the term far right. Anyone to the right of Karl Marx these days can be called far right, but there is a real far right. They may be small, but they do exist, and they are unsurprisingly in perfect agreement about many issues with the woke far left. And David Duke is an example of this. He's defended Ilhan Omar in the past, and this week came out strongly against Israel and Zionism.
Yep, the former Grand Wizard, I think that's what they call themselves, of the KKK, David Duke, and a man who represents the rump of the sort of far-right party in the UK, the British National Party, that has no influence in politics. The two of them came out in this statement on the side of Hamas and against the Israelis. It's a fascinating thing because that, as you say, Rita, that sort of awful, ugly rump of the actual far right that is so far away from any mainstream, actually shares its views with the far left and with the Islamists. And one of the places that they all meet up is on the issue of the Jews. How very unsurprising. But here's the difference, of course, is that everybody knows that they would run a million miles from having anything to do with David Duke, the former Grand High Wizard or whatever it is of the KKK. But how sad that his views are in total alignment with a lot of airheads from the far left and the left in the US, in Australia and elsewhere. They're in total alignment with them when it comes to the issue of the Jews. It's just that the left and the far left seem not to be able to keep their extremists at bay in the same way. It's a great shame for civilization, and it's a great shame for the respectable left.
Douglas, you are in Israel, and earlier this week, you saw that 43-minute unedited video, including body cam footage of what happened on October 7. How has that affected you, and has that changed your view on that conflict?
Well, it certainly, unfortunately, reinforced a number of thoughts I had about the Hamas attack. I was earlier this week near Oz, which is one of the kibbutz that was completely ransacked, ravaged by Hamas that day. I think a lot of people from outside Israel still haven't realized the sheer scale of the attack. It was a battalion-sized attack of terrorists. And people like that small, beautiful community of Nir Oz, near the Gaza border, had 400 people living in it. Funnily enough, most of these kibbutz, or many of these kibbutz, these communities around Gaza, were filled with left-wing peacenik types. They wanted peace with their Palestinian neighbors, very often, campaigned on this, did good deeds for their Palestinian neighbors in the hope that this would incrementally lead to peace. Nir Oz lost over 80 of its citizens to being kidnapped by Hamas. They were stolen from their homes, often having been horribly tortured and taken into the Gaza, where some of them still are. And more than 30 people of that community were massacred right there. An elderly man burnt alive in his house, and much more. I went round what remains of the community a couple of days ago, wrote about it for the New York Post today, and I urge people to just read about this, to confront it, because to confront it is to confront true human evil in our time, and it is to understand the basic Israeli message, which is we just cannot live with Hamas beside us. When they do this, when they glory in it, and when they say, as one of their leaders again this week, that they want to do this again and again and again. It's impossible for the Israelis to live with that.
Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time this evening.
It's a pleasure to see you as always, Rita. Thank you.